Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Environmental Justice Now. Faith Environmental Justice Now is our live show where we discuss issues and topics related to climate and environmental justice in a relaxed and informal way. The past few weeks, we have been focusing on discussions about General Assembly 2021 and our issue priorities. We have a number of bills we support this year, and today we are focusing on HJ 538, Access to Water, Human Right to Water. Please check out our Virginia IPL Action Toolkit for a full list of all the bills we are supporting and helpful information for how you can contact your legislators and details for how to be actively involved in making good legislation for our state and for our neighbors. I'd like to introduce the show for you today, and so get ready for a really interesting conversation. Okay, we're back again. So let me introduce our two speakers, both really great speakers and very knowledgeable about the issues related to water and human rights. Our first guest, Marcela Gonzalez Rivas, she is a professor at the University of Pittsburgh and has been a longtime advocate for water issues. She focuses on sustainable water policy, equity, and water governance. Through her research, she addresses how uneven access to water varies across communities and regions and how planning can exacerbate or diminish such inequalities. Her work is concentrated on Mexico and Latin America more broadly. She is currently focusing on COVID-19 responses to water access and protection in the US and in Pittsburgh. And our second guest today is Jamshid Bakatari. He is the Consumer Advocacy Campaign Coordinator and Community Organizer for the Virginia Poverty Law Center. He has 10 years of experience in community organizing and has a master's degree in international law and human rights from the United Nations University for Peace. And so welcome both our guests, Jamshid and Marcela.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So happy to have you here. And so let's just jump into our conversation today. I'm going to just throw the first question out to Marcela, and then Jamshid, if you want to respond as well, that would be great. How has the pandemic impacted water access in other countries you research and work with right now? Marcela?
Yes, that's a very important question. And basically, the pandemic has reversed decades of progress, not only in terms of water access, since 2000, like from the period of 2000 to 2017, there's been great progress at basic water access and sanitation across the globe. And also improvements at the safest way of providing water, like the direct, like sort of inside the premises of the homes. But the pandemic has erased this and also has reversed the progress made on extreme poverty. Basically erasing the gains. And the implications is that governments are going to be more strained in having resources to address not only issues of basic need, like poverty eradication, but that means that efforts to expand access to water and sanitation are going to face a lot of obstacles. So yes, it's been a big reversal, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Jamshid, do you have anything that you want to add to this?
Yeah, I would just add that it's interesting that this reversal is happening at the time of most immense need for people, not only from the need for sanitation to help keep our community safe from the virus, but also at a time where people are seeing the economic fallout from COVID affecting their livelihoods, and they've never needed access to these basic resources more than before.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And so, just keeping with the topic of COVID-19, just share a little bit why water is so important for people to have access to, particularly in the time of a pandemic.
Yeah. Can I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay. So what I was saying is that this reversal at the same time in basically the COVID-19 at the same time has basically renewed the urgency of expanding access to water. We all have heard the typical recommendations about mask wearing, but also washing hands. And that was the recommendation of the World Health Organization, for example, when wash hands, but when millions of people lack access to water, but also a lot of people do not have access to safe, meaning clean water. And so there's a renewed urgency and widespread recognition on the positive side, the widespread recognition that access to water is essential for public health. So this could be an opportunity in that sort of like making more efforts to make sure that access to water is a priority.
Mm-hmm. What would you say that water, that the U.S., that those of us in the U.S., like in the state of Virginia, what can we learn from the water issues and challenges in other countries?
That's a very good question. Again, one of the first things that I want to say in comparing, for example, the U.S. with other rich nations, like in Europe, for example, the U.S. stands among the high income, like it stands out as among the high income countries because it does not have widespread protections to access to water prior, but also during the pandemic. There's been moratorium issued, but in many of European countries, for example, is basically outright banned water shutoffs prior to the pandemic. I mean, for decades, this has been true. But also there's other mechanisms to ensure and to protect water access, like flows restriction and other mechanisms like social tariffs, customer assistance programs or low-income programs are becoming more, are emerging in the context of the US, but there's not widespread sort of adoption of these programs. And so that's something to learn from outside, right? From similar countries.
And I also just add that here in Virginia, we were particularly slow to enact moratoriums that protected people in the water. The State Corporation Commission at the onset of the pandemic issued a moratorium on all utility shutoffs under its jurisdiction. And of course, with it being the State Corporation Commission, that only applied to privately held utilities. So in most municipalities across the state where water is run municipally, that didn't apply. And it really took months for our state government to effectively respond and protect people's water access if they got it from a municipal source. And I think that really just underscores Marcela's point that the United States lags behind other so-called developed nations in this regard, which is really unconscionable when you consider the immense amount of resources we have in our country.
Right, and it's important also to highlight that the patchwork of sort of protections that took place with different timings and also in many of these places, moratorium of shutoffs have expired. And so people are already facing again in the midst of the pandemic, in some places in the height of the pandemic. So this is really, a lot of people talked in academia about the US exceptionalism. So this is one of the ways in which it is exceptional. It's like the lack of protections to access to water, whereas in other countries, this has been true for decades, really.
Yeah, and I'm here in Virginia, I help operate the utility hotline for the Virginia Poverty Law Center, and we get a lot of people calling in about their utility issues to us. And I remember, just to bring up this issue of the exception that we have here in the United States, there was a woman that called me from a prominent city in Virginia, and she was a middle-aged woman. She had she was living at home with her 3 daughters and her husband, who just had heart surgery. They hadn't had water because they weren't able to pay their bills for 6 months. And somehow the water got turned back on. I don't know how it got turned back on, but she was afraid that she was actually going to face criminal prosecution from the city for having water turned on after it had been turned off, so that her and her family can have access to sanitation and water during the pandemic.
Yeah, these stories are just tragic, and they're very, but they're common, right, across the United States. And when we're thinking about water as a whole, and water from the perspective of as a human right, this is the reason we brought and we're prioritizing this human right to water bill this year with the General Assembly. It is a resolution, HJ 538, and it's being carried by Delegate Aird. But we recognize that not only does COVID-19 exacerbate and amplify the issue, but we also need to be aware of the pollutants from industry, antiquated water infrastructure, and rate increases, that they're all threats to clean water for rural communities as well as low-income communities and communities of color. And what we found interesting when we were doing some of this research was that the Code of Virginia actually states that the control of groundwater resources belongs to the public. This kind of leads to a question about water as a human right. Marcella, tell us a little bit about your work and what you've learned about water as a human right, and particularly as it relates to the United Nations resolution.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot to talk about that, but like 2 key issues have been that, one, the resolution of 2010 of human right to access to water and sanitation that was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations was the result of a long sort of struggle water justice by different global organizing of different groups, including governments that were committed to this. So that's the first thing, to learn that resolution took decades of work, basically, and pushing and advocating for that. And then the second thing to note is that even in 2010, not every single member country signed on to that. 41 countries abstained from voting, including, of course, the US, which I still don't think is a signatory. The UK, Canada, Australia, and Sweden, and Japan. That was in 2010. Since then, many countries have come on board. And more importantly, many countries have included or amended in their constitution the human right to water. Many countries, and also have sort of like changed legislation to toward like they adopting this human right to water. I mean, I can go on. There's a lot of debates about these. And one of the key things is that in that resolution, the UN left the door open. Basically, it was very vague about models for service provision, meaning there's the possibility, there was nothing specific about whether water access or the provision of water and sanitation services should be public or private. And this is a huge debate because the resolution main core center is about providing access to water to all, right? Making sure that everybody has access to water. And when you leave the door open for the private provision of water services, then you are letting in the idea of profit making, which is contradictory or inconsistent to that idea of water as a public good and basically ensuring that the most vulnerable groups have access to water. It's in contradiction. And so there's been a lot of debates. And the last thing I will say about these before others can join is that basically finally, last summer, the special rapporteur for the human right to water, Leo Heller, before leaving, he basically made public a special report on the risks of the private provision of water services by the private sector. And so that was a huge needed statement from the UN to state the different risks involved, and by making sure when the private sector is involved in provision of water and sanitation, there's a lot of risks involved for making sure that the human right to water.
Jamshid, I know you have something to say to add to that, please.
Yeah, so just to add to what Professor Rivas was just saying, it is interesting that the United States always tries to eschew its obligation to the rights of its citizens in these international treaties. A lot of these treaties that bolster the right to water and that we see echo that, the United States has either not ratified it or not signed on to it. And the reason why these efforts were able to become treaties in the first place was through activism and organizing around the globe. And I think the lesson that we can draw from that here in the United States is that we need to start building power in our own communities and start demanding from our lawmakers and policymakers that we uphold these rights to our citizens as well. And I don't think we'll see a greater opening for that than we do right now in this moment, when water is so connected to the health of everyone in the community. Because if one person doesn't have access to that sanitation to wash their hands, that can result in someone 3 neighborhoods away dying, or someone in another city dying because of the COVID-19 pandemic.
And if I can just say one more thing that is relevant to this debate, I just want to reiterate what was just said, which is the importance of social mobilization of different groups across the board, civil society groups, movements, citizens, different organizations with different agendas, but all uniting. This is exactly the resolution of 2010 was like, in that sense, was seen as triumph of the water justice movement. But the key, one thing that is really, really important to emphasize is that water is a very complex sort of like sector, in the sense that it's a concept. Water is seen in various forms. For many, it's an economic good. For others, it's a public good, a spiritual good. It has different values, right? But also it's resource intensive, which means that treating it and cleaning it and making sure that it is of quality and that we protect the ecosystem, the water ecosystems, is expensive. So we need to sort of provide resources to make all these happen. And so the point to emphasize here is that there's different approaches and different models to provide these services. And in the last decades, there's been a move toward privatization and toward the framework of full cost recovery, which is inconsistent, because that means increasing tariffs, which is one of the things that we see in the United States now and other places, is an affordability crisis. That even when you have the infrastructure necessary, that many other countries, the countries that I was talking about in the globe, do not have that infrastructure. But in the US, even when you have the infrastructure, and many communities don't, actually, that's one thing that we know about the pandemic, right? But even when you have that infrastructure, you don't have access to the service because your service has been shut off because you couldn't afford the bill. And that is the model of full cost recovery that many argue is the way to protect the environmental resource. That's the way for people to have the incentives to save water. But I think that there's other ways to make sure that people value water and that still have access, because water is essential for survival. And so I just wanted to add to that, the importance of the debate.
Yeah, and I think the listeners of this program right now are already taking a good step. They're connecting with an organization in their community that's working on this issue. If you want to get more involved, that's the number one thing you can do, is to develop a relationship with an organization or an institution that is working on water as a human right. And there's no better one here in Virginia than Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. So go to vaipl.org and click join my list or join our list, and they'll send you email updates on how you can get more involved in this activism and help push for these measures so that everyone in our community could eventually realize this right.
You know, one of the things that we've recognized here at Virginia IPL is that we really have to inform the public about water, right? You know, I said this earlier this week that in one of the conversations we had about this bill is that, you know, we get up in the morning, we run to our bathrooms, we brush our teeth, we get a glass of water, we take a shower, we make coffee, we use water, and we do it as second nature without actually thinking about how it got to our house and how it got into our pipes and how how it's accessible to us. But many around, and I, you know, recognize my own story. I live in a somewhat rural area where we have well water. Well, I don't have a bill that comes to me every month where I have to pay for water in that same way. And I just think that, you know, when we're talking about equity and when we're talking about making water accessible and affordable to everyone, we need to be thinking about all the ways that people actually access water now. Do you have some other suggestions and ideas? I really appreciate, Marcella, that you raised the issue of this full recovery. That's so much about what we do in the United States is about like bottom line and about commodifying and, you know, making, you know, throwing responsibilities that typically we used to understand as governmental or good, you know, good government to the private sector. And so what can we do to make it more equitable? In some ways, it's not fair that I can, you know, access an aquifer and access groundwater, not aquifer, but groundwater, where someone who lives in a city cannot do that same thing. They actually are receiving a bill every month. How would you respond to that, both Marcella and Jamsie?
Well, what I've learned is that, for example, I live in Pittsburgh, and in Pittsburgh, we have had a story in which I think I remember, I don't know if you saw a New York Times article a couple of years ago about is Pittsburgh the next Flint, about the water crisis and the challenges here in the region about stormwater management and making sure that the quality, like, because infrastructure has not, that's the other piece of the puzzle. Infrastructure investment in infrastructure for water and sanitation sector has been at the lowest point. I mean, since the 70s, there has not been federal investment in the water sector, and it has been decreasing consistently in the United States. And so a lot of these water systems are really old and decaying. And there's a lot of complex issues that come with that and the inability to manage. And this is exacerbated by climate change as well, because there's more extreme weather events, for example. And so if you don't have locally the capacity to clean and treat the water before it goes back to our rivers, for example, there's a problem of the quality of water. And keeping up with the quality of environmental, the EPA regulations of water quality, lead, all these things are exacerbated. And so one of the things that started happening locally was that the tariff rates were increasing and increasing and increasing to the point that there were a lot of water shutoffs because a lot of people were not having access to water. And so there's been a huge, like an important coalition forming initially around issues of stormwater management, like environmental, and making sure that that approach was not just based on infrastructure, like the old way of dealing with it, but more new ways of addressing it, like green infrastructure, parks, sort of like making sure we're investing in our green spaces so that we are able to let nature also take part in the way we manage water. That was initially, but that coalition started shifting towards centering on the threat of lead. the Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority real quick took like a 3-year arrangement with Veolia, a private global corporation, and they did a private agreement, and there was a disaster because their bottom line is to save costs to make profit, and they shift the anti-corrosive chemicals that go in the water that prevent lead to sort of like peel off the pipes. And so we had water advisories and lead spiking in the water. And so that coalition from a diverse set of organizations, religious organizations, labor, environmental, different residents, etc., really mobilized toward against sort of renewing a privatization agreement and to sort of demand a transparent governance. We have to think about these, not only about public versus private, but what public means. Public means that everybody gets to participate, right? That we all have a voice. And we all, like, if water is a human right, we should have a voice in how we see it being managed. And I think that that's the thing. People need to be involved about the most essential aspect, which is water access in our own communities. That's what I would say. And that's my research with my co-author about the Pittsburgh mobilization. Basically, those are our findings.
I think what's really critical about this conversation is the reality that we have to shift the conversation and the narrative from bottom line issues all the time. That's what constantly gets raised as objections, right? Who's going to pay for it? How much money can someone make from this? How much money, do we have to invest? To the issues and narrative about the public good. And as a faith organization, that's one of the things that we're constantly trying to amplify and help people to think anew. And I say anew because 100 years ago, 150 years ago, when these water infrastructure was being installed, that was the attitude, right? How do we protect the citizens and residents of our communities, of our states, of our country from the waterborne diseases and other diseases, but because of the lack of fresh, potable, clean, quality water. And so one of the things that we, in our testimony today, even when the bill was heard in the Rules Committee, we raised the issue of how just 3 of the major religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, all hold water as sacred and critically important, and has not only critical importance for ritual, but has critical symbolic importance for these faith traditions. And many other faith traditions hold water as sacred as well. Water access is critical for human dignity and health. And we all need to be in the conversation, sharing with our neighbors, encouraging not just our legislators, but also raising this as a public good, a common good issue that we all should have the right to water in the same way, almost in the same way as we have right to breathe air, because it is one of the things from a religious perspective. It is a gift from God, and it's a gift from the universe. It's a gift from the earth to all humanity. And so we cannot live without it. All life is created out of water, developed out of water, and no life can function well without it. We are ending at our time now, but if there are last minute statements that you might have, Jamshid, I'll go to you first. Last minute statement before we are ready to sign off, and then Marcella, I will give you the last word.
Well, thank you again, Reverend Dr. Harris, for having me on. From the perspective of the Virginia Poverty Law Center, when you address something like water access, you're not just addressing the issue of water itself. Water is connected to a whole host of other issues that affect communities, in particular low-income communities. High utility bills is a trend that we see again and again that lead to evictions, foreclosures, and bankruptcies. So when we organize to help protect people's access to these utilities, such as water being one of the primary ones, we're also helping to stop families being kicked out of their homes at the end of the day. The best way to do that, once again, is to build a relationship with an organization in your community, in your state, that is advocating for these policy items. There's no better organization working on these issues in Virginia than Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. So go to their website and sign up for their list.
Yes, and I would like to say that groups like your group needs to start thinking about, okay, we're pushing for this resolution, which is fantastic. It's a milestone. What's next? How is that materialization? What does the human right to water mean practically? And that can mean a bunch of things, right? So push for the transparency of governance in terms of the water utilities, the government policies have to be transparent, and people have to participate. And then about affordability, water should be affordable. And there's different utilities all over the country are setting up customer assistance programs and low-income assistance programs. But there's a lot of issues about that, how affordable they are. There's been a moratorium on water shutoffs. So the next thing to see is, when those expired, are people given payment plans and possibilities for people to continue with water access and to pay their bills that are affordable? And so basically, you need to really learn from experiences that are working. Like, for example, the TAP program in Philly is the first program that is basically based on affordability, that households are pay a flat fee based on their income. And so basically, learning from others and from successful programs about affordability to make sure that materialization of the human right to water happens.
Thank you, Marcela Gonzalez Rivas, professor at the University of Pittsburgh. And thank you, Jamshid Bakhtari, Consumer Advocacy Campaign Coordinator for Virginia Poverty Law. We are so really thankful for this conversation today. We are in the midst of General Assembly, so we just got our bills out of one committee. Hopefully we will see it move through the General Assembly and be voted on by both houses and adopted as a resolution. Again, a first step in trying to raise the conversation and help Virginians recognize the importance of protecting and being proactive about water and water rights. We've recognized that there are just so many factors that make this critically important right now. Climate change being one of them, COVID-19, and pandemics to come, recognizing that water is such a critical part of our lives and that we should not take it for granted, that we do need to protect it or we will lose our access to it. So thank you again, and may you both have a wonderful day. And that's our sign off. Go to Virginia IPL to find out more information, virginiaipl.org, GA 2021. You will find our toolkit and a number of other support mechanisms that help you be better informed, but also to take meaningful action in making laws and rules in your state. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you for having me.